There and Back Again. A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins. Now, where to begin?
Hello everyone and welcome back to another installment of the Lord of the Rings Iceberg. Today we'll be focusing on Tier 3. This is where we really plunge down into the waters of the iceberg. I always like to think of the third layer as where most of the meat of the iceberg really is, since this is stuff that not many people know and the topics become a bit more philosophical. Today in the iceberg we are going to be talking about things such as the Silmarillion, the Red Book of Westmarch, and many of the Lord of the Rings games. If any of this sounds interesting to you, then I urge that you stick around and nerd out with me for a while. So without further ado, let's get into the waters of Middle-earth. We'll be starting off the iceberg with the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is a book that would be added to many times over the lifetime of Tolkien. You can kind of think of it as a forever ongoing book that would change throughout its lifetime as Tolkien adds new context to the world of Middle-earth. It starts off with the retelling of how the earth was made in the First Age. It then goes on to tell about how the elves would awaken Middle-earth and how the men would arrive. It also being called the Silmarillion talks about the theft of the Silmarils, the gems that contained the purest light that illuminated Middle-earth. It also talks about the rebellion by Fëanor and how he was exiled from his people. It also speaks about the first wars between the High Elves and, at this time, Melkor. Up next we have the tribes of the elves. This can kind of get a little hairy since there's so many and they branch off so widely. The tribes of the elves are quite large, but the tree is sort of somewhat easy to follow. It starts off with the Quendi, which means elves as a whole race. Then you get into the 5 main tribes of the elves that are the start of the other tribes. On the left you have the Eldar, which is comprised of 3 different tribes. The first being the Vanar, the Fair Elves. Then you have one of the most popular tribes, the Noldor, the Deep Elves with the King Finwë. Then you have the Telari, the singer race of the elves. Under the Vanar and Noldor, you have the Felmari, the Sea Elves, that turn into the Amanyar, those of Aman. And then they turn into the Calaquendi, elves of light and high elves. Under the Telari you have the Sindar and the Noldar, Grey Elves and the Wood Elves respectively. Then you have the Laquendi, the Green Elves, and then under them you have the Amanyar, those not of Aman. And finally you get to the bottom with the Moriquendi, Elves of Darkness. And on the far right you have the other main sect of elves, which are the Avari, the Refusers and Unwilling. Then they turn into the Avanmanyar, elves who would not go to Aman. And then they turn into the Morquendi also. Up next we have Galadriel's hair. I'll let a quote from the Unfinished Tales explain this one since it can do it better than I could. And her hair was held a marvel unmatched. It was golden like the hair of her father and of her foremother Indus, for its gold was touched by some memory of a star-like silver of her mother. And the elder said that the light of the two had been snared in her tresses, therefore making her magical even in the land of Middle-earth. Her hair was seen as a precious treasure of the world before darkness, thus leading to elves such as Fëanor coming to try and claim it from her, in order to make the Silmarils, in which she refused many times. However, later she would give 3 strands of her golden hair to Gimli, and he would set it in crystal as a pledge of goodwill between the races. Next we have the Red Book of Westmarch. The Red Book of Westmarch, also known sometimes as the Red Book of Pirianath, is the book in which Tolkien's Legendarium of Middle-earth is written. These being the books that you see Frodo and Bilbo writing in during the movies. The first Red Book is said to be nothing more than a journal from Bilbo while he was traveling with the band of dwarves, also known as There and Back Again. Shortly before the end of the War of the Ring, Bilbo would pass on this book to his heir Frodo, where Frodo would take it to Bag End and then organize Bilbo's writings, and he would also compile his own writings of his quest during the War of the Ring, thus giving us the 3 books we know now as the trilogy. Next we have Del Toro's Hobbit. This refers to what the Hobbit could have been if Del Toro continued his direction of the movie. He was the initial director of the movie series, Jackson bringing him on first since they were very good friends, and he was also a fan of his works. He would also act as co-writer alongside Jackson and Walsh. This would continue for 2 years where the production team would promise the general public that everything was going according to plan. However, Del Toro would soon leave the team. Due to time constraints and ongoing other projects such as Hellboy, he would be forced to depart to allocate time for his other streams. On the bright side, he left in very good spirits and still stayed on the team as a co-writer. However, he would not be able to be at the helm anymore, going on to state that this was one of the hardest decisions of his life. After that, we have Dwarves Were Made by Aule. I've already kind of talked about this a good bit in the last iceberg, so I'm not really going to go into it much. If you want to see more about it, you can go check out the last video. But really, it's just saying that Aule is kind of the dwarves' god and their creator. Up next, we have, did Balrogs have wings? The statement that Balrogs have wings is kind of widely debated since there are arguments for both sides, and they're quite well backed up. The initial description of the Balrog in Moria raised the question of the wings in the first place. The reference states that his enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it stretched out like two vast wings. The second reference states, suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. This is where the speculation comes in. Seeing as in one reference it states that the shadow is so great that it looks like it has two wings that stretch over the room, where it's really just its shadow, and in the other it seems to explicitly state that it has wings. This is widely due to interpretation, since on one hand the wing statement are interpreted literally, and on the other hand people see it as a sort of speed of the creature moving wingedly or fast. Tolkien often uses statements like these. This can also be seen whenever Gandalf uses the statement, fly you fools. The people who are against this, though, say that not everything that J.R.R. says should be taken literally. Up next, we have a little bit of a repeat. I talked about this a little bit in the last iceberg. It is Lord of the Rings Gollum. To summarize it, Lord of the Rings Gollum is made by Didac Entertainment, and it seemed to be the next big Lord of the Rings game. You can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes. But it turned out to be kind of a half-baked open-world exploration game, and it sucked fat butt. Up next, we have Lord of the Rings, The Third Age. I'm not sure if this is really talking about the video game or the actual Third Age in the movies and books. I'm going to be talking more about the video game in this one. But if you want to know more about the Third Age, let me know and I'll go into it in another video. However, the video game that also goes by the same name is a role-playing video game that obviously takes place in the Lord of the Rings universe. It was a multiplayer game for the Xbox, PlayStation, and GameCube that was made by EA Redwood, and is widely seen as a success, receiving an 8.5 on Steam. There is also another version of the game for Game Boy Advanced that turned it into a turn-based strategy game. Up next, we have MERP. Sticking with a tactical turn-based strategy game, MERP, also known as Middle-earth Role-Playing, was a tabletop role-playing game based on the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit books. It's similar to the likes of D&D and games such as RuneQuest. The main meat of the game being character building, such as creating characters and leveling them up, giving them your identity, and using them to fight monsters with a very in-depth combat system. Being a tabletop means real-life 3D figures and objects, many of them being made out of solid metal, and are seen as collectible items today. However, some companies such as Mithril Miniatures still makes figurines like this to this day. Up next, we have Tribes of Men. Men were the kin of the children of Iluvatar, and they are also referred to as the Secondborns by the elves. Seeing as how many of them were the last sentient beings to come into being, they were destined from the start to rule over Middle-earth. There are 7 groups or tribes of men in Middle-earth, starting with the Dunedain. These were people who inherited an island from the elves between the Undying Lands and Middle-earth, the island known as Numenor. These people would go on to become the Numenoreans. Next, we have the Black Numenoreans. After the fall of Numenor and its destruction, some of the men that remained loyal to the king were also known as Black Numenoreans. These people would be very hostile towards the allies of Gondor and even fight on the side of Sauron during the war. Next are the Easterlings. These were men that were widely overtaken by Sauron's grasp after the defeat of Morgoth. They were also known as the first enemies of Gondor, and they can be seen riding elephants in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Next are the Northmen. These were men that remained near the Blue and Misty Mountains. Not a ton is known about them, but the men of Dale are Northmen, and they can be seen in The Hobbit. Next are the Dunlendings. The Dunlendings are bitter enemies of Rohan and had lived in the Great Wood that covered Eriador. Not much is known about them either, but they would be on the side of Sauron during the War of the Ring. Next are the Druidine. These were a group of men that were quite small and always stooped over and lived shorter than most other races of men. King Elisar would grant the land of Druidine Forest to them forever after the War of the Ring. And lastly, we have the Hobbits, which I think we all know a pretty good bit about. Up next, we have Hobbit language. Hobbitish, also known as the Hobbit language, is widely the same language of most men. They widely speak the language of Westeron. However, they speak their own sort of dialect, which makes them sound very odd to most men of Gondor, seeing as they have a sort of whim in their speech and habits. Since they are seen as polite and well-mannered, they often only use formal language when talking, so it makes it weird for most men seeing them, as they rarely speak formally unless it's to royalty. Up next, we have Sam represents British World War I soldiers. So we talked about this one a good bit in the last video too, seeing as one of the other tiers talks about Sam's loyalty to the group and the sacrifices he makes, and you might be asking, Alex, why are there so many repeats? And to that I say, I don't know. I have no clue. I just make the videos. Up next, we have Flat Earth. It is true that when Middle-earth was created, it was created flat by Iluvatar. However, it didn't stay that way. When it was initially created, it was flat, and at the center was a dwelling of god beings called the Valar. However, after the rebellion of Melkor and the sinking of the destruction of Numenor, it was reshaped into a round planet that we would see in the War of the Ring. The reshaping of the Earth would take place way before 3319 of the Second Age. However, I believe this is whenever we first see that it is documented. Up next, we have the origins of orcs. Orcs are the most common servants that we see in Lord of the Rings books. They pretty much do everything for their masters, those being widely Sauron and Saruman. However, they came into being well before they were known as the henchmen to these people. They were created by Morgoth during the Years of the Trees in the First Age, where they would also serve in his legion. It is speculated by some of the Eldar that Morgoth kidnapped some of the Akari and then twisted them into orcs using his corruption. They would then go on to inhabit Melkor's tunnels under Middle-earth, where they would then multiply rapidly. Up next, we have the Blue Wizards. The Blue Wizards are somewhat of an anomaly, since they had a mission but are never really spoke of much, and most of what we know about them is speculation. We do know a little bit about them before their disappearance though. The Blue Wizards Alatar and Palando are part of the White Council and arrive sometime in the Second Age, much earlier than the Three Wizards, and they are sent with the task of disrupting Sauron. They would then go on the journey to the south and the east, earning the names Darkness Slayer and East Helper respectively. After their journey, this is kind of where we lose track of them. Since they moved out east, they were never seen again west of Mordor. In fact, they were never seen anywhere at all. Some speculate that they lost their path on the mission and perhaps created their own sort of secret magic cults. Next, we have Lord of the Rings Tactics. The Lord of the Rings Tactics was a game released in 2005 and was only playable on the PSP. It was a tactical, as seen by the title, role-playing game where you could play as characters from the Lord of the Rings franchise. It was also almost a direct one-for-one of Peter Jackson's film adaptations, so all of the character models are derived specifically from the actors' appearances in the movie rather than the books. Besides this, not much is known about the game other than it being fairly well received on launch. Up next, we have the Watchers of Cirith Ungol. The Watchers of Cirith Ungol refers to the two great figures that sat on the thrones outside of the gateway. They were composed of 3 heads that resembled vultures and had black onyx eyes. Each head is said to be facing a different way and that not a single soul visible or invisible could sneak past their vision. Each statue had the power to identify enemies and block them from entering through sheer will alone, and if their grasp were to be breached, they would send out a shrill alarm. The only thing being able to break their will for a short time is the Vial of Galadriel. Up next, we have the 1978 Lord of the Rings and the 1980s Return of the King. These are an American and Japanese collaboration film series that are completely animated. The Return of the King being a movie sequel of the 1977 Hobbit animated movie and the 1978 Lord of the Rings movie. The movies stick to the book rather well and encompass the books through each film. However, the release of the movies did spark rage from the side of Tolkien's estate, seeing as they never fully acquired the rights to the book and franchise. However, the lawsuit was settled amicably and allowed them to release the movie in 1980. The reception after the airing of the movie, however, was lukewarm at best. Next, we have Hobbits or Men. This is kind of another duplication. We talked about this before in the Tribes of Men tier, so I'm not really going to go into it much. But basically, the Hobbits are a sect of men that do not appear anywhere in the chronicles of the elves, and their own origin is widely unknown. And it is speculated that they could have evolved from a sort of savage. Up next, we have Alan Lee's illustrations. This refers to the many illustrations that Alan Lee did for The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series. They veer off from what Tolkien himself drew, seeing as Tolkien had a cleaner drawing style, whereas Alan Lee leaves it more wispy and dream feeling. This left it for me personally to have a more medieval and rustic feeling, where he can appropriately capture the magic that is in Middle-earth. All in all, he had created about 50 illustrations in total, leaving it to about 16 to 20 per book. Up next, we have Grima 8 Lotho. First, I think we should talk about who Lotho is, since we're all probably familiar with who Grima Wormtongue is, but Lotho is a little more less known. Seeing as he is never blatantly mentioned in the series, Lotho is the cousin to both Frodo and Bilbo Baggins, and he is also the only child of Otho and Lobelo Baggins. He is a minor antagonist in the series, taking over the Shire by force, and ruling it as a totalitarian regime. Later on, after the scouring of the Shire, Saruman has Lotho killed after speculating that he would have second thoughts about the overtaking. His remains were presumed to have been eaten by Grima, seeing as when he is confronted about if he had buried him in the first place, he gets defensive and ashamed. Up next, we have New Zealand locations. This refers to the many filming locations in New Zealand that were used to make many of the scenes in the movies, particularly the traveling scenes. There's not much to say about them, but they do span over most of New Zealand and create a general overview and beauty of the landscape. I'm definitely going to butcher some of these names. However, starting off the list we have Waikato. This is the Hobbiton and Shire set. Next we have Wellington, which is home to many of the scenes that contain Rivendell and the places that are adjacent to it. Thirdly, we have Nelson Tasman, which is known as the home of the One Ring, Chesswood Forest, and Dimrill Dale. Fourthly, we have Canterbury, which is also known as the Edoras in the films. Fifthly, we have Mackenzie Country, which is the home to the Pelennor Fields in the movies. Sixthly, we have the Southern Lakes, which is most popularly known as Gandalf's Ride, and is also home to Lothlorien. And lastly, we have Fjordland, which is home to Fangorn Forest. Up next, we have games by Interplay. This refers to what I believe to be only 2 games that were made by Interplay in the 1990s. They were developed in tandem with Blizzard Entertainment, that is also known for making similar role-playing games such as Warcraft. The first being creatively named Volume 1 is a role-playing adventure game that takes place during the Fellowship of the Ring books, where you play as Frodo Baggins and recruit members of the Fellowship, and the games can widely be completed by following the chronology of the books. The second game, Volume 2, is set up the same way where you adventure and complete the game by going through the book chronologically. Up next we have Black Numenoreans. This group of people were talked about shortly in the Tribes of Mentir. The Black Numenoreans, also known as the Kingsmen, or the Party, are a fallen and corrupted clan of Numenoreans that descended from those who were still loyal to the scepter, but were also in opposition to the Valar. Sauron, coming in his fair form to these Numenoreans, was able to use the gift of his speech to slowly corrupt them, and then move their service into that of the Dark Lords. After this, they would oppress the free men of Middle-earth and be a strong enemy to the people of Gondor. Next, we have the Middle-earth strategy games. Middle-earth strategy games is kind of a broad statement, but it could probably be attributed to the Middle-earth games that I believe take place in the Warhammer world, and it can widely be played the same way that Warhammer is played. They are normally played with 2 or more people, and you face off against each other in the tabletop battle. They contain characters such as Aragorn and Frodo and other troops such as the Men of Gondor, Riders of Rohan, and Warriors of Harad, in which each army is either designated a good or evil title. Next, we have Beowulf and Kelvilla. This refers to where Tolkien gets most of his inspiration for The Lord of the Rings. This tier is similar to the Wagner tier in the last video, where they both drew on multiple forms of mythology to make their works. Tolkien drew heavily on the Old English poem of Beowulf for many of his aspects in Middle-earth, such as in the Legendarium, many of the names of the creatures and societal structures are taken from it. Tolkien always admired how Beowulf could have been written in such a symbolic story without ever creating allegory. Many of the races in Middle-earth, such as Ents, Orcs, Elves, and names such as Orthanc can be directly derived from Beowulf. And with that, we're going to round off Tier 3 of the Lord of the Rings Iceberg. Thanks for sticking around and nerding with me. This has been a very fun one to make. Let me know what should be changed, let me know what you liked. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching, and keep your eyes out for the next one, whenever that one would be. And with that, that's all I have for you today. Once again, I'd like to thank you a lot for watching. It really does mean the most. And goodbye.